Okay, let's get straight to the reality of the last 48 hours. Because if you are tracking the indicators, not just the headlines, but the actual movement of assets,
Okay.
we were staring down the barrel of a kinetic event.
Oh, absolutely.
The maps were red, the rhetoric was escalated, the countdown clock had basically run down to zero.
It wasn't just rhetoric, though. The
Oof.
logistical train had, it had left the station. We were looking at strike package being actively assembled.
Exactly. And then yesterday, January 16th, the engine just, it cut out. We have a formal pause on the military option.
A full stop.
So for this deep dive, we're stripping away the noise, we're ignoring the cable news punditry, and looking strictly at the intelligence, the diplomatic cables, and, the operational realities on the ground.
And our mission here is really to dissect how we went from imminent airstrikes to diplomatic priority in, the span of a single afternoon. Because a pivot that's sharp usually leaves skid marks.
It does. So let's start with the situation report. It's January 17th. The headline is "The Commander-in-Chief has stood down." But the way this happened is fascinating.
It really is.
President Trump was actually en route to Florida when he confirmed it. And he didn't cite a breakdown in talks or a UN resolution. He cited a very, very specific piece of intelligence.
And it was about internal Iranian dynamics, which is a highly unusual justification for halting a military campaign.
Right.
He stated, pretty explicitly, that he decided against intervention after days of tough signaling about the protests inside Iran. His whole rationale was that intelligence suggested Iran had canceled plans to execute hundreds of detained protesters.
He even posted a message on social media thanking Iran. And he used the word respect for that decision. Now, from a purely tactical view, that's bizarre.
It is.
Usually stop a strike because the enemy blinked on a weapons program or move troops back from a border, not because of judicial decision about domestic prisoners.
Well, that is the soft power lens, isn't it?
Yeah.
It frames the de-escalation as a humanitarian victory. It lets the U.S. claim the moral high ground. But here's the friction point.
Okay.
That's the Washington narrative. If you look at the cables coming out of Tehran today, they're rejecting the entire premise.
Right. Iranian officials are on the record saying they never had plans to execute those protesters in the first place.
They're essentially saying, you're solving a problem that didn't exist.
So we have a huge disconnect. The White House claims they forced a change in behavior.
And Tehran claims the behavior never existed. But, functionally, it doesn't really matter who's telling the truth about the executions.
Why not?
Because what matters is that it provided the golden bridge, that diplomatic off-ramp, to stop the shooting before it even started.
While that diplomatic game is playing out, though, the physical reality was just incredibly dangerous. The Pentagon wasn't just reviewing options, they were in active preparation.
Oh, absolutely.
We know the DoD had been reviewing options to deploy additional forces to the region. This was not a drill.
And that's why this stand-down is so precarious. You can recall a press release in a second, but it takes weeks to unwind a military buildup. That machinery has momentum. And frankly, the tactical indicators we saw earlier this week suggest we were much, much closer to the edge than the public realized.
Let's dig into that then. Phase 2, the tactical deep dive. Because there were specific operational signals that, they usually only happen right before the missiles fly.
The ones that really get your attention.
And the one that caught my eye immediately was the airspace anomaly.
The 5-hour window.
Exactly. Earlier this week, Iran closed its airspace for 5 hours. Now, to a civilian, that sounds like a delay at the airport.
Yeah, minor inconvenience.
But in operational analysis, that is a massive tell. You don't just shut down lucrative commercial traffic for 5 hours unless you are clearing the battle space.
It's pure risk mitigation. Think about it. If you're sitting in an air defense command center in Tehran, and you think American cruise missiles are inbound, you cannot afford to have a Lufthansa or an Emirates airliner on your scope.
Too much ambiguity.
You have to clear the sky so that anything that flies dies.
Or, and here's the other side of that coin, they were clearing the deck to launch something themselves.
And that's the ambiguity of it.
Yeah.
But the markets, they reacted immediately. International airlines are currently avoiding Iranian and Iraqi airspace entirely.
And that's not a minor reroute. That is a complete reorganization of global transit because the corporate risk models are all screaming imminent conflict.
It is a huge economic signal.
It screams defensive posturing to me. I think they were expecting a hit. But there was another layer here, something messing up the battlefield picture that wasn't just U.S. versus Iran. We have to talk about the Kurdish element.
The third-party variable. This is critical.
Yes.
We saw reports of a Turkish intelligence warning sent directly to Tehran. They flagged the movement of armed Kurdish separatist groups trying to cross from Iraq into Iran.
And geographically, this makes perfect sense. Iran is distracted by internal protests. Their security forces are stretched thin in the cities.
Right.
So if you're a separatist group sitting in the mountains of Iraq, this is your moment. You make your move.
Exactly. But now think about the fog of war this creates. If you're an Iranian radar operator or a border guard, you're on high alert for an American invasion.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, you have armed columns breaching your border from Iraq. Do you assume it's Kurds? Or do you assume it's U.S. Special Forces, maybe a proxy force, kicking off the main attack?
It's a trigger mechanism, a perfect one. If Iran responds to the Kurds with, say, heavy artillery or air power, and the U.S. is watching that on a satellite,
It could look like the start of an offensive.
it could look like the war has started. It creates a situation where an accidental war becomes very, very likely.
And Western intelligence clearly saw this volatility. We have to look at the canary in the coal mine, the Australian directive.
Ah, yes. Australia issued a directive on January 16th, and it wasn't reconsidered travel. It was leave Iran immediately. Get out now.
And when a Five Eyes partner, that's the U.S., U.K., Canada, Australia, New Zealand intelligence alliance, when they issue an order like that, it's not based on a hunch.
No.
It's almost always based on signals intelligence. They likely picked up communications indicating that the Iranian military was moving to an actual war footing.
And Iran wasn't being subtle about their posture either. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made a statement that I think really defines the tactical reality. He said, nuclear talks are possible.
We can talk about atoms, sure.
Yeah, the missile program.
Essential for national defense and non-negotiable.
That's a hard red line. He's saying, we might talk about power plants, but we are not talking about the rockets. And they warned of a strong response to any use of force.
So you put it all together.
Yeah. Tactically, you have a closed airspace, foreign citizens evacuating, armed groups breaching the border, and a defiant military stance on missiles. This was the recipe for a war.
It was. And that brings us right back to the central mystery here. If the tactical reality was that hot, how did the strategy shift so fast? Why did the president blink? Or did he blink?
Let's pivot to the strategy then, because the decision-making process here was, well, it was singular. President Trump stated explicitly that no allies influenced this decision.
He said he convinced himself.
Right.
That is a profound shift in American doctrine. I mean, typically in a scenario like this, you're on the phone with the British Prime Minister, the French President, the Saudis, the Israelis. You build a coalition.
You build consensus.
Here, the president is operating on a sort of personalist model. He looked at the intelligence on the executions, made a personal judgment, and just called it off.
So let's look at that face-saving mechanic you mentioned earlier. Trump says, I'm stopping because you stopped the executions. Iran says, we never planned them. Is this just diplomatic theater?
It's strategic utility. I think that's the best way to look at it. If the U.S. wants to de-escalate without looking weak, they can't just say war is too expensive. They need a win.
A narrative.
A narrative. By framing it as, we forced you to stop a humanitarian atrocity, the administration can sell a stand down to their base as a victory. We spoke, they listened.
And Iran gets to avoid an airstrike that would have set their economy back, what, 20 years?
Precisely. They can issue all the denials they want, but privately, they're relieved the Tomahawks aren't flying. It lets both sides step back from the ledge without technically conceding anything of substance.
But, and this is always the problem with these short-term fixes, the underlying issues are still there. They haven't been resolved. The U.S. stopped the strike. But look at the conditions released by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff today.
The Witkoff conditions. This is the disconnect between the pause and any real peace.
I mean, this list is heavy. Witkoff is asking for deep cuts to nuclear programs and missile capabilities. He wants a reduction of fissile material and an end to all support for overseas proxy forces.
Okay, now compare that to what we just discussed in the tactical section. Foreign Minister Araghchi just said the missile program is non-negotiable.
It's a direct contradiction. On one hand, you have the U.S. Special Envoy demanding they dismantle the missile program to get a deal.
And on the other, you have Iran saying the missiles are the only thing that guarantees their survival.
That isn't a negotiation. That's a deadlock before you even sit down at the table.
It is. The U.S. is prioritizing diplomacy, but the starting terms of that diplomacy effectively cross Iran's primary red line before the talks can even begin.
And the White House knows this. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said today, airstrikes are just one option.
Which sounds like the threat is very much still on the table.
Yeah.
All options on the table is diplomatic code for we're talking, but the aircraft carriers haven't turned around. And we have to consider the Iranian diplomatic stance here, too. We have comments from Mujtaba Firdousapour, who's the ambassador to Egypt.
Why is the ambassador to Egypt significant here?
Egypt is often the back channel. When Washington and Tehran can't talk directly, they often talk through Cairo or Muscat. Firdousapour is signaling that Iran believes in diplomacy, but, and this is the key part, it demands a balanced and fair approach.
Which means what, in their language?
It means they demand respect for legitimate self-defense. In Tehran's view, their missiles aren't offensive weapons to be bargained away. They're the only deterrent they have against a superior U.S. Air Force.
So you have the U.S. saying, cut the missiles, and Iran saying, the missiles are the only reason we're safe enough to even talk to you.
It's a fundamental impasse.
So we have a pause. The engines are idling, but the road ahead is completely blocked. Where does this go in the next 6 months? Let's run the scenarios.
I see 3 plausible paths here. Yeah. And, well, unfortunately, the most likely one isn't the most optimistic.
Okay, let's hear it. Scenario 1.
The diplomatic deadlock. The U.S. maintains the economic pressure sanctions stay on, maybe even get tighter. The military option stays on the shelf, but just barely. And Iran refuses to negotiate on the missiles, sticking to Iraqi stance. The internal protests continue, and we just enter a cold stalemate.
So high tension, low kinetic activity, the status quo, just a lot louder.
Effectively. But that assumes no accidents. Which brings us to scenario 2, the proxy escalation. This is the worst-case scenario. Remember the Kurdish factor.
The Turkish intel about the border crossing?
Yes. If those armed groups keep crossing from Iraq and Tehran responds with a heavy artillery air support, it could trigger a bloodbath.
And if the casualty counts rise?
The humanitarian excuse the president used to stand down just evaporates.
That's a key point. If Trump claimed he stopped the war because executions stopped, but then battlefield casualties skyrocket because of a border conflict, he might be forced back into the military option just to save face.
Exactly. The Kurdish factor is the wild card that could drag the U.S. back in, whether Washington wants to be there or not. If Iran starts shelling those border regions, the humanitarian victory narrative just collapses.
Is there a scenario 3? Is there a grand bargain to be had here?
There is, but it requires a massive shift in thinking from both sides. In this grand bargain scenario, Tehran accepts the peaceful nuclear guarantee. They trade away the fissile material stockpiles for massive economic relief.
But what about the missiles? That's the sticking point.
Well, in this scenario, the U.S. would have to quietly drop the missile demand. They'd claim a huge win on the nuclear front. We stop the Iranian bomb, and they let the missile issue slide into the background to get the deal signed.
That seems, well, unlikely, given what Witkoff said today, demanding cuts to both programs.
It is unlikely. But it's probably the only path that leads to a durable, long-term de-escalation. You rarely get everything you want in these negotiations.
You know, this brings us to a final thought. We're sitting here analyzing doctrine, red lines, airspace closures, proxy groups.
All the moving parts.
But ultimately, this entire pivot, this anatomy of a stand-down, it all hinged on one man.
It did.
The president said he convinced himself. He didn't wait for a committee. He didn't pull the NATO allies. He looked at one specific report about executions, made a personal judgment call, and called off a strike.
It creates a tremendous amount of unpredictability in the system.
Exactly. So if the difference between war and peace relies entirely on the president's personal assessment of a single internal event, rather than long-term doctrine or alliance consensus, how stable is this peace really? What happens when the next report crosses his desk?
That is the question the entire region is asking itself right now. We've stepped back from the edge, but we are definitely still standing on the cliff.
And we'll be watching to see who blinks next. That's it for this deep dive into the Tehran pivot. Thanks for listening.